Yo, welcome back to All About Love. We're going to do chapter 2 today. I've actually tried to make this video, this is the third attempt now because I kept having recording issues. So if you don't know, I'm going through this book and I'm kind of giving my live reactions and insights as I read through it. If you are interested in reading this book with us, you can go to the link in my bio, join through Patreon and our Discord, and we have a book club. Sometimes we do books, sometimes we listen to podcasts together, sometimes we watch movies together. This month, not only are we doing this book by Bell Hooks, we are also watching episodes of Ted Lasso together, which has been super fun. So if you want to join the community over there, we would love to have you. And this is All About Love, Bell Hooks. There is a playlist below. You can check all that out. And let me know any insights that you have from reading the book or from listening to me read the book. I'd love to hear them. And maybe you just stumbled across this because it helps you fall asleep. That's great too. Let's get started. Chapter 2, Justice, Childhood Love Lessons. Severe separations in early life leave emotional scars. I'm already off to a good start. I paused at the break. Severe separations in early life leave emotional scars on the brain because they assault the essential human connection, the parent-child bond which teaches us that we are lovable, the parent-child bond which teaches us how to love. We cannot be whole human beings indeed. We may find it hard to be human without the sustenance of this first attachment. Judith Viorst. We're going to start getting to childhood wounds and attachments. So buckle up. And if you need to take a break because stuff comes up for you, take a break, pause it. I'll be here waiting for you. We learn about love in childhood, whether our homes are happy or troubled, our families functional or dysfunctional. It's the original school of love. I cannot remember ever wanting to ask my parents to define love. To my child's mind, love was the good feeling you got when family treated you like you mattered and you treated them like they mattered. Love was always and only about good feeling. In early adolescence, when we were whipped and told that these punishments were for our own good, I've heard that one. Or, I'm doing this because I love you, also heard that one. My siblings and I were confused. Why was harsh punishment a gesture of love? As children do, we pretend to accept this grown-up logic, but we know in our hearts it was not right. We knew it was a lie. Just like the lie the grown-ups told us when they explained after harsh punishment, it hurts me more than it hurts you. I also heard that one. There is nothing that creates more confusion about love in the minds and hearts of children than unkind and or cruel punishment meted out by the grown-ups they have been taught they should love and respect. Such children learn early on to question the meaning of love, to yearn for love even as they doubt it exists. Sorry, I had like a beard hair in my mouth. It makes me think, when we get into adult relationships, right? Like that yearning she talks about, like we yearn for love even though we doubt we exist. Like that makes so much sense of like the different attachment styles and attachment wounds that we often talk about that a lot of us have to go to therapy to unpack. It's like you're yearning and searching for that love that you're not even sure if it exists. And you've been given, maladaptive models of it. And so you only know to look for it in environments or relationships that are similar to the one that you grew up in. And of course, when she said confusion in the first part there, like a lot of my childhood was marked by confusion of like just not understanding, like why is this happening the way it is? I digress. On the flip side, there are masses of children who grow up confident love is a good feeling, who are never punished, who are allowed to believe that love is only about getting your needs met, your desires satisfied. In their child's mind, love is not about what they have to give. Love is mostly something given to them. When children like these are overindulged, either materially or by being allowed to act out, this is a form of neglect. The very first book we ever did in book club was one called Gifts from a Challenging Childhood. It's a heavy book if you want to grab it. As far as like working through stuff, it's actually the book my therapist recommended to me when I first started working with her. And it talks a lot about the parentified child and childhood enmeshment. So go read that, enjoy that. These children, though not in any way abused or uncared for, are usually as unclear about love's meaning as their neglected and emotionally abandoned counterparts. Both groups have learned to think about love primarily in relationship to good feelings, in the context of reward and punishment. From early childhood on, most of us remember being told we were loved when we did things pleasing to our parents. And we learned to give them as affirmations of love when they pleased us. As children grow, they associate love more and more with acts of attention, affection, and caring. They still see parents who attempt to satisfy their desires as giving love. It makes me think like parents that like give their kids like, to get them to stop fussing, to get them to stop whining, like to, satisfy their desires like that. And I'm not saying the opposite is true, that to be loving is to be withholding, but it makes me wonder how much was like for the parents' comfort, right? So it's like, oh, here you go, sweetie, here's this. But really they couldn't manage their own emotions, right? They couldn't manage their own feelings. And so it's like, oh, just give them this to get them to stop, because it was getting, on your parents' nerves. Not because they were actually helping you deal with whatever you were going through at the moment. Children from all classes tell me that they love their parents and are loved by them, even those who were being hurt or abused. When asked to define love, small children pretty much agree that it's a good feeling. Like when you have something to eat that you really like, especially if it's your favorite. It's spelled out that way. They will say, my mommy loves me because she takes care of me and helps me do everything right. When asked how to love someone, they talk about giving hugs and kisses, being sweet and cuddly. The notion that love is about getting what one wants, whether it's a hug or a new sweater or a trip to Disneyland, is a way of thinking about love that makes it difficult for children to acquire a deeper emotional understanding. We like to imagine that most children will be born into homes where they will be loved, but love will not be present if grown-ups who parent do not know how to love. Although lots of children are raised in homes where they are given some degree of care, love may not be sustained or even present. Adults across lines of class, race, and gender indict the family. Their testimony conveys worlds of childhood where love was lacking, where chaos, neglect, abuse, and coercion reigned supreme. In her recent book, Raised in Captivity, Why Does America Fail Its Children?, Lucia Hogston documents the reality of lovelessness in the lives of a huge majority of children in the United States. Every day, thousands of children in our culture are verbally and physically abused, starved, tortured, and murdered. They are the true victims of intimate terrorism in that they have no collective voice and no rights. They remain the property of parenting adults to do with as they will. There can be no love without justice. Until we live in a culture that not only respects but also upholds basic civil rights for children, most children will not know love. In our culture, the private family dwelling is the one institutionalized sphere of power that can easily be autocratic and fascist. Do as I say, not as I do. Right? I lost my place. My bad. As absolute rulers, parents can usually decide without any intervention what is best for their children. If children's rights are taken away in any domestic household, they have no legal recourse. Unlike women who can organize to protest sexist domination, demanding both equal rights and justice, children can only rely on well-meaning adults to assist them if they are being exploited and oppressed in the home. We all know that, irrespective of class or race, other adults rarely intervene to question or challenge what their peers are doing with their children. At a fun party, mostly of educated, well-paid professionals, a multiracial, multi-generational evening, the subject of disciplining kids by hitting was raised. Almost all the guests over 30 spoke about the necessity of using physical punishment. Many of us in the room had been smacked, whipped, or beaten as children. Men spoke in the loudest of defense of physical punishment. Women, mostly mothers, talked about hitting as a last resort, but one that they deployed only when absolutely necessary. As one man bragged about the aggressive beatings he had received from his mother, sharing that they had been good for him, I interrupted and suggested that he might not be the misogynist woman hater he is today if he had not been brutally beaten by a woman as a child. Although it is too simplistic to assume that just because we are hit as kids we will grow up to be people who hit, I wanted the group to acknowledge that being physically hurt or abused by grown-ups when we are children has harmful consequences in our adult lives. A young professional, the mother of a small boy, bragged about the fact that she did not hit, that when her son misbehaved, she clamped down on his flesh, pinching him until he got the message. But this too is a form of coercive abuse. The other guests supported this young mother and her husband in their methods. I was astounded. I was a lone voice speaking out for the rights of children. Later, with other people, I suggested that had we all been listening to a man tell us that every time his wife or girlfriend does something he does not like, he just clamps down on her flesh, pinching her as hard as he can, everyone would have been appalled. They would have seen the action as both coercive and abusive. Yet they could not acknowledge that it was wrong for an adult to hurt a child in this way. All the parents in that room claimed that they are loving. All the people in that room were college educated. Most call themselves good liberals, supportive of civil rights and feminism. But when it came to the rights of children, they had a different standard. It makes no sense to me. As someone who grew up in that environment and someone who also lived that way, because that's like, that's what was modeled for me. That was like the religious environment I grew up in. Like, I think it was always a thing that bothered me, this kind of hierarchy, right? Like I think of, like I would hear growing up, like that my actions like would be either a good or bad reflection on my parents, right? And that like makes me a service to them. But they're the ones that are supposed to be investing and cultivating me, right? Like in the chapter before this, when Belle defines love, she talks about it as giving yourself over to yourself or to another's spiritual development, right? So like my parents are supposed to be the ones, and I have a pretty decent relationship with my parents, but my parents are supposed to be the ones helping me develop. But somehow my development or lack of, or where I did well or didn't do well, was somehow about them. You know what I mean? Anyway, let's keep going. After a water break. One of the most important social myths we must debunk if we are to become a more loving culture is the one that teaches parents that abuse and neglect can coexist. Abuse and neglect negate love. Care and affirmation, the opposite of abuse and humiliation, are the foundation of love. No one can rightfully claim to be loving when behaving abusively. Yet parents do this all the time in our culture. Children are told that they are loved even though they are being abused. It is a testimony to the failure of loving practice that abuse is happening in the first place. Many of the men who offer up their personal testimony in Boyhood, Growing Up Male, tell stories of random violent abuse by parents that inflicted trauma. In his essay, When My Father Hit Me, Bob Shelby describes the pain of repeated beatings by his dad, stating, "From these experiences with my father, I learned about the abuse of power. By physically hitting my mother and me, he effectively stopped us from reacting to his humiliation of us. We ceased to protest his violations of our boundaries and his ignoring our sense of being individuals with needs, demands, and rights of our own." Throughout his essay, Shelby expresses contradictory understandings about the meaning of love. On the one hand, he says, "I have no doubt that my father loved me, but his love became misdirected. He said he wanted to give me what he didn't have as a child. On the other hand, Shelby confesses, what he most showed me, however, was his difficulty in being loved. All his life, he had struggled with feelings of being unloved. Makes me think a lot of my dad. My dad had like a really rough upbringing, and it's a thing that I think about a lot, like reactive parenting. So even if you did better than your parents and they did better than their parents, but the motive was just don't do what they did, that is still you parenting differently, but because you're reacting to what you perceived as a child or your parents perceived as a child. And so I know my dad did that. He's told me that. He's told me like that he was like, I was never going to do that. I determined I was never going to do that. And to my dad's credit, if the abuse he suffered on a scale of 1 to 10 was a 9.5, he brought it down quite a bit, you know, to like maybe a 5, maybe a 6, and the worst times a 7, and other times like I have lots of loving memories of my dad, or at least enough to where, you know, I don't totally hate him and we have a pretty decent relationship now. But sometimes I wonder, especially after reading this book, is the way that my dad would stand up for me sometimes. Like, he made that really clear. He has 3 sons, me and my 2 brothers, obviously. My older brother was from his first marriage, didn't live with us. But with me and my younger brother, he would always say, like, no one messes with my boys. And I saw him do it several times. If he thought somebody was treating us unfairly, he would not hesitate to confront them. And so I'm appreciative for that. But I also wonder if that was my dad trying to protect himself by protecting us. You know what I mean? The little boy that was trapped in him, that didn't have someone to stand up for him, you know? And my dad, his older brothers, particularly one, was super abusive. Like, would just hit him and knock him out. That was his thing. And get in a disagreement, just punch my dad so hard and knock him out. And so I wonder if my dad, in part, even though I'm grateful that he was that protective, if in part he was living in reaction to that, instead of doing the hard work to heal his own wounds, so that he could, instead of reactive parenting, which was better than the parenting he received, he could consciously parent. He could choose how he wanted to interact with me and my brother, choose how he met our needs, instead of just going, well, my parents did this, so I'm just going to do the opposite. You know what I mean? My dad, man. I should show you guys a picture sometime. He was a cute kid, man. Sorry. I'm not sorry. It's okay to have emotions. When Shelby describes his childhood, it is clear that his dad had affection for him and also gave him care some of the time. However, his dad did not know how to give and receive love. The affection he gave was undermined by the abuse. Writing from the sphere of adult recollection, Shelby talks about the impact of physical abuse on his boyhood psyche. As the intensity of the pain of his hits increased, I felt hurt in my heart. I realized what hurt me the most were my feelings of love for this man who was hitting me. I covered my love with a dark cloth of hate. A similar story is told by other men in autobiographical narrative, men of all classes and races. One of the myths about lovelessness is that it exists only among the poor and deprived. Yet, lovelessness is not a function of poverty or material lack. In homes where material privileges abound, children suffer emotional neglect and abuse. In order to cope with the pain of wounds inflicted in childhood, most of the men in boyhood sought some form of therapeutic care. To find their way back to love, they had to heal. Many men in our culture never recover from childhood unkindness. Studies show that males and females who are violently humiliated and abused repeatedly with no caring intervention are likely to be dysfunctional and will be predisposed to abuse others violently. In Jarvis J. Masters' book, Finding Freedom, Writings from Death Row, a chapter called Scars recounts his recognition that a vast majority of the scars covering the bodies of his fellow inmates, not all of whom were on death row, were not, as one might think, the result of violent adult interactions. These men were covered with scars from childhood beatings inflicted by parenting adults. Yet he reports none of them saw themselves as the victims of abuse. Throughout many years of institutionalization, I, like so many of these men, unconsciously took refuge behind prison walls. Not until I read a series of books for adults who had been abused as children did I become committed to the process of examining my own childhood. Organizing the men for group discussion, Master writes, I spoke to them of the pain I had carried through more than a dozen institutions, and I explained how all these events ultimately trapped me in a pattern of lashing out against everything. Like many abused children, male and female, these men were beaten by mothers, fathers, and other parental caregivers. When Master's mother dies, he feels grief that he cannot be with her. The other inmates do not understand this longing since she neglected and abused him. He responds, she had neglected me, but am I to neglect myself as well by denying that I wished I'd been with her when she died? That I still love her? Even on death row, Master's heart remains open. He can honestly confess the longing to give and receive love. Being hurt by parenting adults rarely alters a child's desire to love and be loved by them. Among grown-ups who are wounded in childhood, the desire to be loved by uncaring parents persists, even when there is clear acceptance of the reality that this love will never be forthcoming. Often, children will want to remain with parental caregivers who have hurt them because of their cathected feelings for those adults. Cathected, if you didn't listen to the chapter before this, explains what cathect means. They will cling to the misguided assumption that their parents love them even in the face of remembered abuse, usually by denying the abuse and focusing on random acts of care. In the prologue to Creating Love, John Bradshaw calls this confusion about love mystification. He shares, I was brought up to believe that love is rooted in blood relationships. You naturally loved anyone in your family. Love was not a choice. The love I learned about was bound by duty and obligation. My family taught me our culture's rules and beliefs about love. Even with the best intentions, our parents often confuse love with what we would now call abuse. To demystify the meaning of love, the art and practice of loving, we need to use sound definitions of love when talking with children. And we also need to ensure that loving action is never tainted with abuse. In a society like ours where children are denied full civil rights, it is absolutely crucial that parenting adults learn how to offer loving discipline. Setting boundaries and teaching children how to set boundaries for themselves prior to misbehavior is an essential part of loving parenting. When parents start out disciplining children by using punishment, this becomes the pattern children respond to. Loving parents work hard to discipline without punishment. This does not mean that they never punish, or that when they do punish, they choose punishments like timeouts or taking away privileges, natural consequences. They focus on teaching children how to be self-disciplining and how to take responsibility for their actions. Since the vast majority of us were raised in households where punishment was deemed the primary, if not the only way to teach discipline, the fact that discipline can be taught without punishment surprises many people. One of the simplest ways children learn discipline is by learning how to be orderly in daily life, to clean up any mess they make. Just teaching a child to take responsibility for placing toys in the appropriate place after playtime is one way to teach responsibility and self-discipline. Learning to clean up the mess made during playtime helps a child learn to be responsible, and they can learn from this practical act how to cope with emotional mess. Were there current television shows that actually model loving parenting, parents could learn these skills. I was talking to, who was it? Oh, my buddy Chris. He was talking about how a lot of the TV trope dads, obviously there's goofy dads and whatever, but at least in some more modern TV, he was talking about how he would pull from this TV dad, right? Which is interesting, but also sad, because it's that means he didn't have that model from his dad. And so anyway, I just think I'm trying to think, what are some good examples of TV dads? And I think of Phil Dunphy from Modern Family. That's the one that comes to mind. So let that motorcycle go by. The weather's getting warmer out here, so people are, now that we're getting out of the winter, getting ready. Television shows oriented towards families often favorably represent children when they are overindulged or disrespectful or are acting out. Often they behave in a more adult manner than the parents. What we see on television today actually at best models for us inappropriate behavior, and in worst case scenarios, unloving behaviors. A great example of this is a movie like Home Alone, which celebrates disobedience and violence. But television can portray caring, loving family interaction. There are whole generations of adults who talk nostalgically about how they wanted their families to be like fictive portraits of family life portrayed on Leave It to Beaver or My Three Sons. I'm sure there's more examples, but I find it interesting that in those two shows, those are examples primarily of father love. We desired our families to be like those we saw on the screen because we were witnessing loving parenting, loving households. Expressing to parents our desire to have families like the ones we saw on the screen, we were often told that families were not realistic. The reality was, however, the parents who come from unloving homes had never learned how to love and cannot create loving home environments or see them as realistic when watching them on television. The reality they are most familiar with and trust is the one they knew intimately. That's one of the things, that part there, the reality they are most familiar, hang on to that word, with and trust is the one they knew intimately. I talk about a lot of times in our Discord community and like with friends and stuff, how we often mistake the familiar for safe, right? So we gravitate to this because it feels familiar, and so we trust it and we feel safe around it, even though we're not actually safe. And so part of healing a lot of times is learning what safety feels like for you and the things that bring that safety about and pursuing those things instead of the things that were modeled and patterned for you. There was nothing utopian about the way problems were resolved on these shows. Parent and child discussion, critical reflection, and finding a way to make amends was usually the process by which misbehavior was addressed. On both shows, there was never just one parenting figure, even though the mother was absent on My Three Sons. The lovable Uncle Charlie was the second parent. In a loving household where there are several parental caregivers, when a child feels one parent is being unjust, that child can appeal to another adult for mediation, understanding, or support. We live in a society where there are a growing number of single parents, female and male. But the individual parent can always choose a friend to be another parenting figure, however limited their interaction. This is why the categories of godmother and godfather are so crucial. When my best girlhood friend chose to have a child without a father in the household, I became the godmother, a second parental figure. My friend's daughter turns to me to intervene if there is a misunderstanding or miscommunication between her and her mom. Here's one small example. My adult friend had never received an allowance as a child and did not feel she had the available extra money to offer an allowance to her daughter. She also believed her daughter would use all the money to buy sweets. Telling me that her daughter was angry with her over this issue, she opened up the space for us to have dialogue. I shared my belief that allowances are important ways to teach children discipline, boundaries, and working through desires versus needs. I knew enough about my friend's finances to challenge her insistence that she could not afford to pay a small allowance, while simultaneously encouraging her not to project the wrongs of her childhood onto the present. As to whether the daughter would buy candy, I suggested she give the allowance with a statement of hope that it would not be used for overindulgence and see what happened. It all worked out just fine. Happy to have an allowance, the daughter chose to save her money to buy things she thought were really important. And candy was not on this list. Had there not been another adult parenting figure involved, it might have taken these two longer time to resolve their conflict. And unnecessary estrangement and wounding might have occurred. Significantly, Love and respectful interaction between, I'm going to give like a good example of that. My partner, there was an accident outside of my house, and my partner lives out of town, right? And so I'm outside with the accident, and one of my kids saw what was going on and was getting scared. And so they reached out to my partner who lives across the country, and because I was unavailable dealing with the actual thing, was able to offer care to my child. I'm not going to go into all the details, but they just said, hey, if for whatever reason your dad is unavailable because he's at work or, tired, or maybe he's just not able to listen for whatever reason, you can always reach out to me. Isn't that wonderful? I think it's wonderful. I love them very much. Significantly, love and respectful interaction between two adults exemplified for the daughter who was told about the discussion ways of problem solving. By revealing her willingness to accept criticism and her capacity to reflect on her behavior and change, the mother modeled for her daughter, without losing dignity or authority, the recognition that parents are not always right. Until we begin to see loving parenting in all walks of life in our culture, many people will continue to believe we can only teach discipline through punishment, and that harsh punishment is an acceptable way to relate to children. Because children can innately offer affection or respond to affectionate care by returning it, it is often assumed that they know how to love and therefore do not need to learn the art of loving. While the will to love is present in very young children, they still need guidance in the ways of love. Grown-ups provide that guidance. Love is as love does, and it is our responsibility to give children love. When we love children, we acknowledge by our every action that they are not property, that they have rights, that we respect and uphold their rights. Without justice, there can be no love. Chapter 2. So let me know what y'all think down in the doobly-doo. If you want to get more content from me, I'm going to try and post more stuff here on YouTube, but the primary place is TikTok. As long as TikTok is still around, you can find me there at Dope Dad, or Not Actually Leonidas. And for the most direct contact, if you want to join in on this book, read it together, is to join that group I was telling you about. Until then, there's a playlist below. Appreciate everything, all your engagement and feedback. I love to hear what you think about this. Bell Hooks, I think I said this in the very first video, is one of my all-time favorite authors. So if you got anything out of it, please let me know. And until then, sweet dreams. I'll see you tomorrow.